In the last video, we added this detect silences button. So as we click it, it'll create regions that exceed the 0.8 seconds here, but I can set this to a different value and then add those regions as well. And in this video, we're gonna make sure that there aren't any duplicate regions that are created and also remove any overlapping regions. So if I were to create a new region and decide that I want to cut this out, so I click trim, then a new region is created that contains all of the overlapping regions into one. All right, let's get started. I want to get rid of these overlapping regions. I mean these duplicate regions. And so whenever trim history is being set, I want to make sure that there's a check so that it doesn't set multiple duplicate regions. So whenever setTrimHistory is called, there should be some kind of function. Let me prompt cursor now. There should be some kind of function where it'll check the current list and the incoming list and then remove any duplicates. And once it removes the duplicates, then it can actually set the trim history. Let me just remove that file as the context. I'll add whatever I find necessary as I go through the prompt. The video editor context has a state value called trim history. And whenever the trim history is set using the respective updater function, I can see multiple duplicates in my trim history state. Can you please create a function that checks for any duplicates in trim history before it updates the trim history? And so right here, I wasn't sure how to do this, so I asked ChatGPT, how do I pass a callback function to a state updater function in React.js? And what inputs does it receive? Because I wanted to know, for example, here I have the set trim history, right? This is being called by this add trims to history, which is ultimately called whenever I click on, I think it's the detect silences, handle trim. So whenever I click on handle trim, this function ultimately gets called, some logic is run, and then it finds those new regions that I have selected, and it takes those new regions that I've selected and adds them to the trim history once I click the button. And you can see this is a callback function. And what I wanted to know is, can I define a callback function here that takes more inputs than just the current state value? For example, here, this callback function, all it's doing is it's calling it previous, but this is the current state of the trim history. And then it's returning a new list with all the previous entries along with the new ones. Obviously, it's not checking for any duplicates here. So I want to know if I can write a custom function that I can pass in here that takes in the new ones and the old ones and then checks for any duplicates before it returns a new list. And that's why I asked ChatGPT if this is possible. And it says, in order to pass a callback function to the state updater, you can do it like this. So this is how you define your state. And then to update that state, you just use the setCount updater function. And then you pass in the callback in here, where the input is the previous count. And then it answers the question, what does the callback receive? The callback looks like it only receives the previous state value as its argument. As you can see here, this is the previous state. And if we keep reading, here's an example with an object state. So here the user state is initialized with a name and age. And then if I want to set the user, then it just takes that initial or previous user state. It copies over all the values in that object, and then you can update any new values by just adding them here. But it looks like it only accepts the previous state value as the input. And so I asked it, remember, I'm not too familiar with React because it's been a long time, so this is how I do research. And this is how you could do it too. Whenever you don't have a question, just ask. You can either ask an LLM directly or you can ask in Cursor. I like to ask LLMs because some of them are better for certain things than others. And then this also helps me keep a separate thread from my Cursor. Or if I'm finding that every month I'm exceeding the limit of how many fast requests I get with Cursor, then by doing it this way and asking the LLMs directly, then I don't run into that issue. All right, so I ask it, is there any way to pass it more inputs? The state I am managing is a list of items, and I would like to add items to the final state, but within the callback function, I would like for it to check those new items against what is already there to make sure I'm not adding duplicate items. It says, okay, gotcha. It knows I want to use a callback function. And then it says, you're already thinking in the right direction using the updater function to get the latest state. Unfortunately, React doesn't allow you to pass extra arguments directly to the updater callback. It only receives the previous state, as we already know. But you can work around this by wrapping your logic in another function that closes over the extra data you want to use. So here is an example. And here I have this function called add unique items. It takes in the new items. And then within this function, it calls the updater function. And the updater function, as we know, only receives the previous items as the input. But within here, this is how I can pass it the new items. So I just have to define a function like this. And in fact, I can just copy this and paste it into my cursor prompt. I'll paste it down here, and then I'll say, we will need to wrap the setTrimHistory updater function in another function so that I can pass in these new items to this wrapper function. Let me just add as shown in the example below. Let me wrap this in example tags just so it doesn't get confused. Can you please replace any instances where I'm using setTrimHistory with this new wrapper function and pass in the new items that I'm trying to set the trim history with? Okay, I think that should be good. I think you should be able to understand with that. So if I look at my code, I'm going to search the entire code base, setTrimHistory. I want to know where it's being called. And it looks like it's all within the video editor context. So I can see it here. This is within the add trims to history, which is called by clicking on the trim button, this trim button right here. And then where else is it being used? Next time it's being used is down here, and this is within the detect silences function, which is run when I click on this detect silences. Okay, and then where else is it being called? Let me just keep scrolling. Where do I see it? Let me just search setTrimHistory. So here's where it's being added to the list of values so that I could provide it to the children. Here's where it's being initialized. And this is the one we had already looked at. And then this next one is also one we looked at. It's the detect silences. So there's only those two times. So it should replace this line right here with a call to this wrapper function. And it'll pass in the detected silences as well as, well, that's all it'll pass into the wrapper function. Within the wrapper function, I'm going to be calling this the setTrimHistory updater function. Anyways, let's just run the prompt and let me make sure there's no other changes. Okay, that looks good. So let me run it. And again, it's already thinking, but I forgot to provide it with the context, but that's okay. My code base isn't very large, so it can quickly find the right file to work with, and that's what it did. So it's still thinking, but we'll review once it's done. Okay, so it just finished with everything, and let's take a look at the application to see if it works. I'll refresh it, and then let me click detect silences. Let me drag. Okay, there's no duplicates. That's awesome. Okay, so it fixed it. Let's take a look at the code base to see what changes it made. Okay, so here's the add unique trim history callback function. It takes in the new items. All right, good. We'll look at the logic a little bit later. But we can see it did replace setTrimHistory here with this wrapper function, and it passes in these new trims that it got from up here. And then it should also have done that down in the detect silences. So here it is again. It's calling that function with the detected silences only, because within this add unique trim history items, it's calling the setTrimHistory updater function. So now it replaced the value that it's listening to in the hook, because this is the detect silences hook. Detect silences callback function right here. And so it's listening for changes now to this new callback function. All right, that looks good too. And then it's just exporting that. Although it's not being used by any other file. Let me just search it. And the entire code base, yeah, it's not appearing anywhere else. But I'll leave it anyways. Let me just accept everything except for this, because I still have to review that. That one, that looks like, I mean, we knew that this was the right way to do it beforehand. So the fact that it did it, we already know it's going to work. And we actually just tested the app, so we already know it works. Okay, so let's review what's happening inside of this function. I'll just accept it so it's easier to read. And let's see what it's doing. So it's taking in the new items, and then it's calling setTrimHistory. setTrimHistory only receives the previous items. So here it's creating a list called updated using the previous items. And then using the new items, it's going to iterate through each of them and check for duplicates. So it's going to look at the current state or the current updated array and then see if it can find a duplicate by iterating through the values in the updated list. And if there's an existing item with the same ID as the new item that we're iterating through in this loop right here, or if the existing item start time and the new item start time are basically equal, if they differ in less than a millisecond, or if the end times differ in less than a millisecond, then it's going to consider it a duplicate. And if it's not a duplicate, then it'll update the updated list with that new item. Otherwise, it's going to say it's skipping it because it's a duplicate. And then it finally returns the updated items. And this updated items array is what is going to be used to set the trim history. Awesome, so it did exactly what we wanted it to do. If I pull up the cursor thread, I can read everything that it has to say, but I already knew how it needed to be implemented. So I don't need to read this because I already understand what it did. Now, before I finish, another thing I wanted to do, let me refresh. I actually think it fixed the other issue we had, didn't it? No, it still didn't. I can see that these are overlapping. Now I want to add more logic into this add unique trims history and have it check for overlaps. So I'm going to prompt it and say, great, that worked just as I wanted it to. Thank you. I would like to add another check inside of the add unique trim history items. I noticed that some of the trim history items have overlapping times. I would like to combine any overlapping trim history items into a single item. A trim history item overlaps another one if their start and end times overlap. That should be good. Please update my add unique trim history items callback function to combine any overlapped items before it sets the trim history. Okay, with that, I will make sure that whatever changes I have right now, I'll stage them. That way I can easily visualize any new changes that come in. Okay, so just finished thinking and I made some changes. Let's go into the app to see if it works as expected. So let me just click on detect silences and we can see that the region that was there as a duplicate before is no longer there. Now, what if I were to create a region here? So because I'm creating a new region and it overlaps with the ones here, then these four should disappear and now I should be able to have just one region. So if I click trim, and that didn't work. It now has 2 extra where I should have removed 4 instead of adding 2 extra. So let me go into the code to try to understand. I can look at the description here, but I think the changes that I made should be easy enough that I could read the code just as quickly as the summary. So here is just a simple change, converting it from const to let. So it's doing a first pass, it says. It's just going to check that there are no duplicates. And just like before, it's going to add that new item to the items to add instead of updated. I guess updated will be updated later on. Let's see, the second pass. In the first pass, it checks that the new items aren't already there. It doesn't check, it checks for duplicates. And then in the second pass, because we're still looping these new items, what's it gonna do? It says check for overlaps and combine them. And it looks like it's a lot of code here. So I figured it might have a hard time with this prompt just because I didn't really define what an overlap meant. But let's see where it went wrong. So here are all items, and what it's doing is it's taking the previous items, or not the previous items. Yeah, it is the previous items right here so far, and the items to add. And the items to add, you know what? I'm not going to review this code. What I'm gonna try to do is prompt it better. So I'm gonna fix this prompt so that it can understand what I meant by overlapping times. All right, something I can say is I can tell it to organize the regions based on the start time. So here, whenever these regions are created, they are automatically added to the trim history in order of ascending start time. But that may not be the case when I'm creating regions. For example, if I create this one, and then I create this one, and then this one, and I click trim, these three will be added into the trim history, but obviously they're no longer going to be in order because this one has an earlier start time than this one back here, but this one was already added to the trim history. So when this selection here gets added to the trim history, it's going to be after this one. So one way to simplify this logic here that it has, because it looks pretty complex, I don't think it should be that complex to be able to detect if regions are overlapping. So one thing I can say is, I noticed that some of the trim history items have overlapping times. You can see this by sorting the trim history items by their start time. And if one item has an end time that exceeds the start time of the subsequent item, then those two overlap. You can continue this check for the rest of the list to identify all of the items that overlap. Let me see if I still want to leave the rest of this prompt. I would like to combine any overlapping trim history items into a single item. And then this is where I had tried to define what an overlap meant, which wasn't very good. Last statement is, please update my add unique trim history items callback function. Let me just combine that into one so that it's easy to recognize that it's a function name. And let me try again. Since I'm editing the context, the prompt that I had before, it should just overwrite everything that it's already done. So I'll hit submit, continue and revert. Okay, so it finished responding, it made some changes. Let's see if this new logic works. So I click detect silences. We still don't see the duplicate ones down here. The overlapping ones. But now if I create this region and hit trim, it now still leaves that region. It's a different color now. Looks like it implemented the same exact logic. Okay, I really don't want to look into this code just because there's just so many checks and for loops I don't like. So I'm going to, let me pull up ChatGPT and see if it can do a better job of solving this kind of problem. I have a list of start time and end time segments from an audio. This list of items is not sorted, and some of these segments overlap, meaning that one segment might be within another region or ends after the other one begins. Below is the format of each of these items. And then let me just copy what these regions look like. Let me go into the console. Let me just copy one of these regions. And really all I need is the ID and the end time and the start time. So let me just create a list, a dictionary here. And I should just say start, and this is a float, end is also a float, and ID is a string. Can you please write an algorithm that looks through this list and checks that there are no overlapping segments. If it does find overlapping segments, please combine them into one segment. And this overlapping segment will have a start time corresponding to the earliest start time of the overlapping segment and the latest end time of these overlapping segments. Let's see what it does. I can keep prompting cursor to get it right instead of doing it this way, but what I really want is to have just one prompt with cursor. That way I can share this prompt with you guys in the description, and it's pretty clear with just one single prompt, so that when you run it, cursor gets it right. Okay, so ChatGPT has responded. It says, you're describing a merge intervals problem with an extra twist. Each segment has an ID, but we're only using start and end time to detect overlaps. Here's a clean and readable algorithm in JavaScript. So it sorts the segments by start time, iterates through the list and merges any overlapping segments, outputs a new list of merged segments, each with the earliest start, the latest end, and then optionally a generated ID. All right, so this is already looking a lot better than what we have out here. Maybe it's the same. So let's see, it takes in the segment, it makes sure that there are segments, and if it doesn't find any, then it just returns an empty list, because what is it going to organize if there's nothing there? And then it's going to sort them by start time, and then it creates a list called merged. The first entry is going to be just the first segment of this sorted list, and then it's going to iterate through the rest of the sorted list starting from the second item, or index 1. So since we're at the second item, the previous one is the first one from the merged list, and the current one is the current sorted item, and it checks for overlap. So if the start time of the current one is less than or equal to the end time of the previous one, then it's going to merge them. It's going to say the previous end is the greater of the previous end or the current end, and the previous start is going to be the lesser of the previous start or the current start, and the ID is just going to combine the IDs. We can fix that later. But if they don't overlap, then it's just going to take the current one and it's going to push it to the merged list. And then it's going to continue on to the next item on the sorted list, and then until it reaches the end, and then it returns the merged list. That's beautiful. That's very simple. And actually, now that I take another look at this is the same code that ChatGPT generated. It's just done in a different order. This one compares the previous item and the current one, whereas over here we compare the current item and the next item. But it does the same thing. And then for the merged ID, it just takes the merged item start time and the merged item end time. But here is where it's checking the overlap. So if the current one end time exceeds the start time of the next one, then they overlap, obviously. And because they overlap, it's going to check that the end time of the next item exceeds the current end time. And if it does, then the current merged end time is updated. Does it ever update the start time? Because over here we're updating the start time, right? We're using the minimum. Yeah, and I think that's the problem. This code right here, it's checking the timestamp, and I don't even know if that's a value that's provided in our region. Let's see. Does it have timestamp? No, and that's why it's not working. At least not as it should. So let me just copy over this logic so that I can replicate it here. So if current merge time overlaps with the next item, really I should just have this line right here. The current merged end time is going to be the max of the current merged end time or the next item end time. And that should be done within this loop here. And then the current merge start time should be the minimum of the current merge start and the next item start. And so I can delete this. And then it's assigning a next time down here, but Is that next time ever used? Let me just delete this as well. Set the ID. Really, I'm just copying the logic that I have here. This is basically, these 3 lines are these 3 right here. So I can actually fix this prompt if I wanted to, and I will for you guys, put in the description. But the mistake that I made is I didn't provide cursor with the format of my regions. And that format is this right here. Each region has all of these values. And so it's just kind of taking a guess. So all this was done just to update this value, current merged, and nothing else is going to run. So it's going to continue on with this loop. It's going to move on to the next item in this sorted list. These all items, all that is the trim history regions, and they're sorted. So now the next item should be the next region as far as time, time moving forward. So it'll run through this again, and then it's checking, it's getting the next item, and it's checking if that item overlaps with what is currently set to be the current merged. Because if it does overlap, then we need to continue updating this current merged value. But if it doesn't overlap, then we can finally push this current merged into the merged items, and the current merged is set to the next item. So with that, it should work. And let me go into my app. And first, let me create several regions that have less than 300 milliseconds. And then if I were to create new regions that exceed 800 milliseconds, it shouldn't create any new ones because all these regions should already be accounted for. So detect silences, all right, so that does work. The only time it doesn't work is if I were to create this new region and then click trim. But aside from that, this does work. So let me stage that. And all these as well, I can stage. Let's see, are there any other file changes? No. So I'll stage this. So now let me look into why it is that when I create a region like this, what's happening here? When I create this region, I think that's not updating any state. That's just happening within the audio waveform component. And if I look at the console, I can see region created right here. Let me refresh. Let me detect silences, reset the console, create a region, and yeah, all it does is log this created region, which is done right here. It's not updating any state, it's just logging it, right? But when I hit trim, then let's go to the playback controls. Trim, this is the handle trim. And again, if I let me just hit trim, I want to see what's in the console. Trim, I see all these logs. So it says added trims to history, added trims to history, and it logs these new trims. I can see that it has a list of 9. So it looks like it took what it had before and the region that I created manually. So that's not good. That's not what we want. It should only have the new ones, which should be this one here. So we'll have to fix that too. I'll worry about that one later. I don't think that's what's causing the issue. So let's continue investigating. So it's calling this add trims to history, which is in the video editor context. If I search it in there, I can see it's right here. Add trims to history. What else is it logging? Skipping duplicate trim. I guess that's happening. Skipping. Where's that happening? Inside the video editor context right here. Skipping inside of our add unique trims history. So this function is being executed. These new items are being filtered. It's skipping the duplicates. And then it's even logging this merged overlapping items into this region. So that's actually a good sign. Merged overlapping items into, that means this is running. And it even says original items were 9, so those were the 9 that were automatically created. And after merging, there are only 5, which makes sense because it added 1, so that brings it to 10, but it got rid of 4, so that brings it to 6. Did I do that math right? Let me try again. Detect silences, let's delete that. So let me highlight and refresh that. Trim. Okay, so when I hit trim, there are 9 items. It says original items were 9. After merging, there are 5. What am I saying? I was just counting one extra. So yeah, I got rid of 4 when it started with 9, so that brings it to 5. Original items, where's that being logged? Original items, down here. All items, length, after merging, merged items. setTrimHistory, merged items. So there's 5. And that's what the trim history, so the trim history, if I look at it, components, context provider, value, click, trim history, and there are only 5. Yep, there's only 5. Let's see, I can see the first one starts around 7 seconds. Probably can't see it because I'm in the way. Next one's about 10 seconds, and then 17, I think that's here. Yeah, that's roughly 17. That's when it ends. And then the third one is this one here, which starts at 38. Is that what this is? That's 28. So let's see, 43, wait, 38. Yeah, that's this one. So it does sort it. So that's this region here. And then the last one ends at 45, which is right here. Yep, that's 45. So the trim history, okay, that confirms that this is working as expected. Great. And it's the audio waveform that doesn't update. So the bug really is in the audio waveform component. It should have an effect hook that listens to the trim history. And we just confirmed it a few changes ago. That's this one, right? So this one should be running. And here we have this handle trim history change. Whenever that function runs, it logs it. Do we see a log there for that? Because right here is where I updated, after this log is where it updated the trim history. Because that trim history was updated, it's running this twice. It's skipping the duplicates again. Okay, we'll have to fix that. But it's checking, it's merging again. Yeah, so it's running it twice when it shouldn't. And then handle trim history change. So this is running and it says region created. Okay, it created a region that corresponds to this red one, I think. The end time it says is 38.99, so roughly 39. Yep, that's it. And the start time is almost 29. So that's right here. Yep. So it did create this region, and then the color, I think it said a color. I don't know what this is, but it could be red. All right, so when this handle trim history is being run, it's taking the existing regions, getting the existing region IDs. Okay, this is where it's going wrong. So it's checking the existing regions and making sure that for each item in the trim history, that existing region doesn't exist, and it checks it by ID. And because we changed the ID of this overlap region, that region, according to the audio waveform, doesn't exist, and that's why it creates a new region and assigns it a color red, and then it adds it to the regions plugin as a separate region. And then later on, it goes into the existing regions, and it's still working with what was existing before. And for each region, it's again just checking against the trim history, making sure that that item is part of the trim history. And if it is, then it draws it up. Okay, so now we're getting somewhere. Basically, we need to update the logic in this effect hook here, in this function, basically, handle trim history change. And it needs to clear the regions that are in this audio waveform and only add them based on what's in the trim history. Now I'm thinking, is there any case where that might not work so well? Let me just think through this. So I refresh the app, right? There's no regions that are created. The trim history is blank. If I hit detect silences calls the setTrimHistory function that updates the trim history. And then this effect hook right here inside of audio waveform listens for those changes, because the trim history now has values, whereas before there were no existing regions, right? This was empty, but now it does have values. So anytime it loops through the trim history, it's going to look at the existing regions, which are empty as of right now. You know, we're still going to create them. We haven't created them yet. So anytime it looks at the existing regions to see if this incoming trim region has an ID, this is going to return false. So the reverse of false is true. And so this is going to execute. It's going to create the region, and then it's going to add it. And it's going to do that for all the items in the trim history. And then it's going to loop down here for the existing regions, which it had defined in the beginning. So in this case, this is the first time we've reached this function, right? And there are no regions that were created before. So this is empty, so this isn't going to run. But now if we go into the app and say I want to create regions that are now 300 milliseconds, and I click detect silences, then what's going to happen within the audio waveform is as soon as it receives those new trim histories from the update that this button execution made, it's going to receive the trim history, right? And it's before it creates the regions, it's going to take the existing ones, which were the ones that exceeded 800 milliseconds, and then it's going to check all the items in the trim history. And for any new ones, basically, if they didn't already exist on the audio waveform, it's going to create the region object and then draw the region. And now this will execute, this existing regions, because we did have some before. We had the ones that were created when the threshold was 0.8 seconds. And so for each of those regions, it's going to find the corresponding trim item from the trim history. Then it's going to make sure that it's assigned the right color. So I don't actually need all this logic. All I needed to do is, I wonder, do I even need the existing regions? Does it even need to know what they are? I think all I really need is to take the trim history and create the region. It will need to wipe the old ones. So I can ask cursor, and I will. I'll ask it, how do you delete regions from the audio waveform component? I mean the Wavesurfer library. Let me go into ChatGPT for that. I'm using the Wavesurfer.js library to display an audio waveform on my application. I can create regions on the audio waveform using the regions plugin, using this command. So let me just copy that. Using something like, and then let me paste that in, regions plugin ref.current, add region options. Let me ask it, how do I delete a region? All right, it started to respond, and it says I can add a region like this, yeah, and I can do just region.remove. Okay, great. So what I will do is I'll get the existing regions, and then I'll take the existing regions and loop through them. Existing regions for each region, and then instead of logging it, I want to do region.remove. Okay, so that wipes the slate clean. I think that's the right way to say that phrase. Anyways, and now I want to create the new regions based on what's in my trim history. I don't need to check if it already has, I don't need to add that check to see if the region is already there, because I'm just going to create them from new. Oh, I can see the color. That's the color here. So it's defining the region options, and then it's adding them, created region for trim history item, and then it logs it by ID. And then this right here, I can just delete. So let me delete that. And then I'll update this comment, create regions for trim history items. Delete that last part. And I think that should work. So let me go into my app. Let me click detect silences. Let me draw this here and then hit trim. Perfect. That did it. That's exactly what I wanted. The only thing I need to change is the color, because this one's red and these other ones are a different color. So let me go into where these are being created, because I think the options here for these regions are in the video editor context. So it should be under color, right? So let me search for color. Yeah, I can see it here. That looks like a different color value than what I have in my audio waveform. Yeah, it is. So I think I should actually define like a helper function that I can just pass in the ID that I want to use, the start and end time, and maybe I can pass in the timestamp, or I could just calculate the timestamp when it executes. That way I can control the colors from one location. But I'll do that in a separate video. I'll create a video where all I do is make a ton of fixes to the app. For example, fixing this one right here, this region that was created in the beginning. I won't do it now just because this video has already gotten pretty long, but it is working the way we want it to. I can create regions, trim them out, and then I can create a bigger region and trim that out, and then it just has one region. But there's still other bugs that I need to fix. For example, when I click the text silences, you can see, hey, I didn't even test that, but it just showed that it worked. So I clicked the text silences and it didn't create any regions in here because they would be overlapping with this one that already existed, right? So there's no need to. But one thing I need to fix is this one region here. I don't know why it's being created. And then there's probably other bugs that we found throughout this that I haven't fixed. I just can't remember what those are right now. I think one of them was duplicate executions of some of these functions. So yeah, I'll have a separate video where I troubleshoot those issues, and that's all we'll do in that video, but that'll come sometime later. And with that, I am ready to commit my changes. Actually, I do want to say that all of these edits that I made, a lot of them I did without prompting cursor. I was reading the code and researching outside of cursor to understand what was going on, and then making the changes based on what I discovered in my research. And I could have just prompted cursor to fix all of this. I could have defined what I was seeing and prompted it multiple times until it got it right. And maybe I would have gotten the result that I was looking for. But that's not the point of these videos. The point is to show you that you can build applications using cursor, but you still want to understand the code, because if you don't understand what's going on, you won't be able to troubleshoot what the problems are. And it's only by understanding the code that you can really understand what cursor is building for you. And when you understand what it's building for you, you can continue to build even without cursor. And then also by understanding the code, you get to understand how it is that code is written, how it's structured, and how it works together. So your understanding of code gets better, and in turn, your understanding of how to prompt cursor also gets better. And so cursor and other tools like it, like Windsurf and Bolt and Replit, all these tools that are code editors, they're not meant to replace what you should already know how to do yourself, which is to code. You should know how to do it yourself. And yes, you can probably build out an entire application without really understanding what's going on. But at some point, you will face a problem that you can't solve by just prompting cursor, because you might have to look through error logs. You might need to understand what the error is, or know where to look. But what you'll find as you work on applications using code editors, AI-powered code editors, and you're vibe coding your way through till you build a production-ready application, you'll find that you're doing a lot of learning by prompting these tools to generate code for you. And so naturally, you will learn how to code with these tools. But I just want to emphasize that it is important that you understand what these tools are doing. And that's why I didn't prompt cursor to make all these changes that I wanted to, these minor changes in order to update this code, so that it would create the regions the way I wanted it to. Although I could have. I do like to provide a little bit of explanation for the code that cursor generates in these videos, so that you can learn. If you don't already know how to code, then you learn with me as I'm building this application. Anyways, with that, let me just commit these changes. So I'll just tell it, please follow these instructions carefully. And then I'll paste the document that has my instructions for the commits. Let me just make sure these are the changes that I'm going to be staging. And now I'm ready to execute this. This was the original prompt that I had given it, and then Down here is the other prompt. Okay. So I'll submit so I can get a commit message and be done. Wait, let me stop it. I think there was something I didn't want it to do, right? Add unique trim history items. Okay, never mind. I thought there was code that I didn't want it to commit into one message, but all this can be in one commit. All right, so it looked at the stage changes, and then for a commit message, it just wrote a subject line with no body, but the message says, optimize trim history to prevent duplicates. That's not all it did. It also checked for overlaps. So I don't like that it didn't add that part, but whatever. They're not all going to be perfect. I can read the rest of this, but if you want, just pause the video and take a look. I think I explained what was going on pretty well, so I don't think I need to read that. So I'll end this video here. If you like this content, please give it a like and subscribe to my channel to see more like it. Hope to see you in the next one.